The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective.
As the situation in the Middle East continues to escalate, tensions between the United States and Iran are escalating again, despite official willingness to engage in talks. President Trump again announced military action if no agreement is reached on Iran's nuclear program. At the same time, he emphasized his close coordination with Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Quote, "If military force is necessary, we will use it," Trump told reporters. An agreement must be reached as soon as possible, otherwise Iran faces grave danger. Netanyahu also reiterated Israel's position that if no solution is reached, military action is inevitable. Direct talks between Washington and Tehran took place in Oman with participation of U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Agraki. The goal is to reach a new agreement after Trump unilaterally withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal in 2018. But parallel to these diplomatic signals, the U.S. government is pursuing escalation. Since the start of a new U.S. military campaign in Yemen on March 15th, according to Houthis, more than 100 people have been killed, including many civilians. An airstrike in Hodeidah alone killed 13 people, mostly women and children. The attacks focus on strategic locations such as the Hodeidah airport area and the capital, Sana'a. At a meeting in the White House, Trump and Netanyahu demonstrated unity on Iran, but their assessment of Turkey revealed nuances. While Netanyahu lamented the deteriorating neighborly relations with Ankara, Trump praised Turkish President Erdogan as a very intelligent, strong man and emphasized his good personal relationship with him. Trump even joked that he could mediate any problems between Israel and Turkey. He even offered Erdogan his congratulations for his role in Syria, coupled with the claim that Erdogan had achieved what no one has achieved in 2,000 years, that is, the control of Syria. Trump's statements on the future of the Gaza Strip are particularly explosive. In a disturbing mix of cynicism and economic calculation, he once again spoke of a plan to place Gaza under international control, ideally by the United States. Trump called the territory an incredibly valuable piece of real estate and envisioned distributing 2.1 million Palestinians among other countries to create a free trade zone, a place where people are no longer killed every day. These statements caused outrage, especially against the backdrop of the ongoing Israeli offensive in the Gaza Strip and reports of massive civilian casualties. The negotiations now beginning with the United States and Iran can hardly disguise the threat of a further spread of wars in the region. The military threats, the attacks in Yemen, Trump's open support for Israel's hardline, and his peculiar proposals for a so-called reorganization of the Gaza Strip leave little room for diplomatic progress. Rather, the Middle East appears to be once again becoming the scene of increasingly openly military geostrategic power games with the danger of further escalation. In other news, no one can explain why, since, as they say, it is the tariffs that are bringing recession to the U.S. economy. The slowdown was predicted by the data of international organizations as early as last summer, long before Trump's election. At the same time, they showed the synchronized slowdown of the other imperialist centers. Beyond the predictions, there was something more tangible as early as last summer. That is, the Black Friday in the United States and the other stock markets in the EU and Asia, which had collapsed last August, reflecting a deeper problem, which is none other than the overaccumulation of capital. The explosion of business profits in previous years, the ups and downs in the labor market and in the stocks, especially in sectors that had previously had largest profit margins, such as those of new technology, reflect this deeper problem. A second inexplicable phenomenon is that during Biden's presidency, taxes collected from tariffs were much higher, almost double than during Trump's last presidency. Here too, as in the case of tax breaks for big business, which Trump instituted in his first term, the Democratic government not only did not change anything, but built on them, maintaining or even further expanding tariffs and all kinds of sanctions against other countries, in the context of further intensifying competition, for example with Russia, with the United States estimated to have sanctions in force in over 1/3 of the countries worldwide. What does this all confirm? It confirms that the tariff policy is part of the United States strategy, which the new Trump administration is now implementing much more aggressively against China. This so-called existential threat to the United States' interest, as the government circles say and repeat in their official text. And that is precisely why all bourgeois analyses that try to ignore what this signifies, the battle for primacy, are doomed again and again to absurdity. It seems that the US government also sees the issue of tariffs from a similar perspective. As US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said in a recent speech to the Economic Club of New York on the issue, quote, "The international trading system consists of a web of relationships, military, economic, political. No one can take sides of it in isolation. This is how President Trump sees the world, not as a zero-sum game, but as interconnections that can be rearranged to advance the interests of the American people," end quote. In other words, he placed the issue of tariffs within the general framework of competition and the correlation of forces within the imperialist system, exactly how Lenin defined it 100 years ago, as a combination of economic, political, and military power. U.S. economic policy is trying to respond to its relative weakening of the U.S. at all three levels, military, economic, and political, essentially attempting the impossible, which concerns meeting a series of goals that contradict each other and which, in summary, are as follows. 1. To strengthen the productive base and investments in the United States itself, while simultaneously targeting its main competitors, securing and maintaining a series of critical raw materials and technologies, and expanding its key markets and key alliances against China. 2. To reduce the huge U.S. trade deficit, while simultaneously supporting the dollar as the so-called global reserve currency. 3. To increase state revenues with new taxes and productivity, which is based on the intensity of exploitation, and at the same time to strengthen the so-called purchasing power within the United States, especially in the areas most affected by the outsourcing of industrialization. And 4. To try to escape a new capitalist crisis of overaccumulation by trying to kick the can down the road. But in reality, it is bringing it closer and closer to crisis with its policies and exacerbating its effects in all sectors. For example, with the rise in inflation, the increase in the cost of borrowing, and so on. The analogies that the figures of the current government make with the U.S. economic policy that followed the Great Depression of 1929, and specifically the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, are anything but accidental, pointing out that the level of tariffs will be the highest since 1937. These laws, as well as a series of economic policies, such as the infamous New Deal, were then deployed precisely to try to escape a new major capitalist crisis, repressing the labor popular movement on the one hand, and on the other, to prepare and shield the capitalist economy in view of World War II, which was rushing forward at the time. The analogies with today are obvious, and the lessons are the same. History confirms that the administrators of capitalism employ as a medicine for one thing is for another poison, that political movements obey the laws of capitalism, and that there cannot be any supposedly peaceful division of the world among the imperialists. The huge difference between then and now is that the United States is fighting this battle not as the rising power in the imperialist system, but as the declining power, with its primacy challenged by China at all levels. In other national news, Chevron was ordered to pay a Louisiana municipality $745 million to repair environmental damage to wetlands caused by decades of violations by Texaco. The ruling is part of a wave of similar lawsuits against energy companies and could set a precedent for future litigation. The money will be used to restore the wetlands that the company damaged over decades. The ruling is likely to set a precedent for similar lawsuits filed by other local municipalities or counties in the state against other energy companies. The lawsuit against Chevron, brought by Plaquemines Parish, is just one of at least 40 that coastal communities have filed against fossil fuel companies since 2013. The lawsuit alleged that Texaco, which was acquired by Chevron in 2000, violated state law for decades by failing to apply for permits to use coastal lands and by failing to remove oil and gas equipment when an oil field in Breton Sound, southeast of New Orleans, was shut down. Louisiana law requires that all energy production sites used by energy companies be remediated, restored, decontaminated, and returned to their original condition as nearly as possible after the completion of operations. Specifically, the sentence includes $575 million in compensation for the loss of land, $161 million for pollution damages, and $8 million for the removal of abandoned equipment. All jurors approved the sentence.
We'll be right back with more of New Worker News here on 92.9 FM WZML. But I want to remind you that every day throughout this country, workers are subjected to injustices and humiliation at the hands of the capitalists, from unpaid wages to mass layoffs. So we at New Worker understand the tyranny that the workplace is for workers. This is why we fight to expose these injustices. Only through militant organization of the working class can we stand toe-to-toe against the bosses. So this is why we want to hear from you, the listener. Are you having issues at work? Bosses cutting your hours or wages? Are you or your fellow workers' safety being thrown out of the window in the name of ever-increasing profit? Well, you are not alone. So reach out to us to tell your story. You can anonymously send an email or even a voice memo to cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that is cwpusa@protonmail.com. And check us out online at newworker.us. And now back to New Worker Radio, only here on 92.9 FM WZML.
It has been 3 weeks since PhD student Rumeysa Ozturk was arrested by masked and plainclothes immigration agents in Somerville, Massachusetts. Ozturk, a student at Tufts University, was on her way to have dinner with friends when she was approached, handcuffed, and loaded into an unmarked car. Defying court orders prohibiting her removal from Massachusetts, ICE immediately transported her to Vermont before moving her to an ICE detention facility in Louisiana, where she remains in custody. In her official statement since her arrest, Ozturk wrote about the poor conditions she and other detainees face. She detailed cramped living spaces where more than 24 people are held in cells meant for 14. She described sleep-depriving conditions, with fluorescent lights triggered at all hours of the night by staff walking by, entering the cell, or shouting to wake those forced to work in the kitchen at 3:30 a.m. As for the reason for her arrest, the government claims Ozturk has ties to terrorist organizations, but has yet to present any evidence or charge her with a crime. In reality, her arrest appears to stem from her support for the Palestinian people and her outspoken criticism of the genocide in Gaza. This was confirmed just 3 days after her arrest, when Secretary of State Marco Rubio proudly admitted to revoking Ozturk's visa, stating, quote, "Every time I find one of these lunatics, I take away their visa," end quote. He went on to say, "If you come into the United States as a visitor and create a ruckus for us, we don't want it." Ozturk is not alone in facing retaliation for speaking out against the genocide being perpetrated by Israel and facilitated by the United States in Gaza. According to Inside Higher Ed's national tracker, over 1,200 international students from more than 180 schools across the nation have had their visas revoked. In Pennsylvania alone, there have been at least 19 revocations from 7 different universities, including Carnegie Mellon University and Gannon University, which saw 7 and 5 revocations respectively. Revoking visas is not the only way the United States government is tightening its grip on universities. to align academic institutions with state policies, particularly its international relations agenda, the government has begun freezing funds or threatening to do so for universities that do not escalate repression against students, teachers, and workers for mobilizing for an end to the massacre in Gaza. 3 universities, Columbia, Harvard, and Cornell, have had contracts or funding cuts. Columbia lost hundreds of millions in funding. Princeton faced a freeze on multi-million-dollar federal grants, and Harvard had over $2 billion in federal funds frozen, despite Harvard President Alan Garber publicly stating the university's willingness to work with the government on tackling anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, Northwestern University has been threatened with an investigation into civil rights violations. So committed is the state to forcing universities into compliance that it formed the Federal Strike Force to investigate 10 universities for allegedly failing to protect Jewish students and members of the institution from illegal discrimination. While the Trump administration is carrying this out, it should be understood that Democrats are not free of culpability. After all, it was the Biden administration that sent police to break up mobilizations at universities last year. This crackdown is clearly retaliation for the pro-Palestinian student movement that erupted at colleges nationwide. These protests were a thorn in the side of the capitalist class, which saw its imperialist plans in Gaza jeopardized by the movement. To stamp out this popular indignation, the ruling class is using the state to create a climate of fear and intimidation, making examples of movement leaders and participants. They do that so that while trampling on people's rights only exposes the bankruptcy of the bourgeois judicial system, the laws and courts of capitalist society will always favor the ruling class, and they will not hesitate to bend or break any laws necessary to maintain control. This is not the first time the bourgeois state has used immigration law to suppress movements it deems threatening. The early 1900s saw a rising militant labor movement in the United States, with workers, especially foreign-born ones, organizing unions and strikes despite violent repression. Alongside the labor movement, a growing socialist movement, inspired by the Great October Revolution, eventually led to the formation of the Communist Party in 1919. The government, revealing its class character, sought to crush the workers' movement with repressive laws like the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which criminalized anti-government speech. Its greatest weapon, however, was the Immigration Act of 1918, which allowed the deportation of anarchists, a term broadly applied to foreign-born communists, trade unionists, and other undesirable individuals. From 1919 to 1920, mass arrests of so-called radicals were carried out by U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer in what became known as the Palmer Raids. Many of those arrested, including workers and trade unions, were swiftly deported. The course of the workers' movement is not linear nor uniform, but progresses through ebbs and flows, a rise and a decline. Though the raids dealt a harsh blow to the workers' movement, they could not stop it entirely. By the 1930s, the movement surged once again, reaching new heights. A series on Netflix, Adolescence, has come to reignite the debate about social problems of modern capitalist society, such as youth delinquency, the role of the family, the educational system, and social media. Many of us discussed it, exchanged concerns, interpretations, and fears, because the series does not leave any glimmer of hope. Experts and non-experts have taken a public stance with discussions on shows, articles, etc. This is a series that statically depicts a social reality, a fragile 13-year-old boy who urinated on himself during his arrest in the transitional, insecure, and conflict-ridden stage of adolescence, which is influenced by various personas and their regressive views on gender relations that thrive on the internet. This boy becomes a victim of cyberbullying by a classmate and ends up brutally murdering her with a knife. Both the directorial choice of the single shot that follows the heroes in real time and the conscious choice of the creators to put in the place of the protagonists an average working-class family with parents struggling to cope and a child next door with intelligence and good school performance made many of the millions of viewers who have watched the series identify with its heroes. Amidst an intense emotional roller coaster, you wonder what went wrong. What could and should have happened differently? The series is open to various interpretations, highlighting various individual causes, but leaving out the main cause. That cause is the capitalist system itself, and its extreme violence, which cultivates individualism, the distorted and rotten cultural and social values that are spreading rapidly through the internet, which is owned by large business giants. The capitalist system is based on individualism and competition, leading to alienation, a lack of meaningful communication, and especially the alienation of children whose personalities are in the process of being formed. The series does not deviate from the cliché of placing responsibility on the family, especially on the father, a victim of his own experiences, who cannot express his love and tenderness towards his children. The series itself does not come to our screens from nowhere. It streams on Netflix within the context of over-promotion of what is known to many as juvenile delinquency. Even more, it comes at a time during a general climate of war preparations at all levels, including the intensity of repression, a cultivation of fear and submission of society, and so much more. It is no coincidence, in the very first scenes, the shocking invasion of fully armed police forces into the family's home, who break down the door, throw them down to arrest a child. Violence and repression that, subsequently, are clearly justified by the creators of the series, even diligently building the profile of an impeccable so-called rule of law, with the police officers insisting on explaining to the little one his rights, and the rest of the family enjoying all the services of the police department, from coffee to a free lawyer. It is no coincidence that the Prime Minister of Great Britain proposed that the series be shown in all middle and high schools in the country. And what is his goal? What will be the result? To open the discussion, or to familiarize students, parents, and teachers with similar incidents and their violent repressive treatment? Or is it a series that is primarily aimed at adults, and especially the dead-end way in which it examines the issues? What impression does it leave on a peer of the protagonist's age? The intensity of repression and the stricter treatment of minors who break the law is the general direction applied by all governments. Let us consider what is happening in our country. The police, in schools, cameras, punishments, expulsions, and the imprisonment of minors. However, the repressive mechanisms, with the United States as the striking example, do not address the problem. They cannot in any way address the deeper social and economic conditions that lead to juvenile delinquency. The series is aimed at people who were born, raised, live, work, and raise their children in a society that at its peak has individual responsibility in all aspects of life, including raising children. And this is precisely what the entire discussion that followed the series reinforces, sometimes to a deafeningly exaggerated degree. For example, in order to substantiate the agenda of so-called violence resulting from the toxic masculinity of today's patriarchal society, even the scene in which the father, devastated by the realization that his son actually committed a brutal murder, refuses to be touched by him, is exploited. The absence of any hint about the real cause of the problem, which lies in the system itself, fits perfectly within the discussion. The confession of the soul, the guilt of the two parents for how they stood by their son, how they responded to the long hours of work, how they spoke to him, what activities they took, etc. So that the father's apology comes as a natural consequence, and thus emphatically underlines once again the individual responsibility of the parents. A conclusion which conveniently fits with the increasingly strict penalties we see for families like those that exist in the state of Florida. The attitude of the two parents is expected and justified. We cannot deny that the responsibility and the special role that parents have in raising a child with different qualitative and quantitative characteristics depending on their age, let alone in such a difficult situation. However, what one cannot attribute to these parents, as well as to the vast majority of parents today, is whether they care, are interested, and make an effort for their child. The primary issue, therefore, is on what foundation, in what society, under what conditions, can any efforts of parents actually matter and bear fruit, and even further, how any mistakes and failures are corrected. And here we begin to see the overall social context within which children and young people today develop and shape their consciousness and way of life. Although the series presents several aspects of the social life of the 13-year-old Jamie and all teenagers today in black and white, for example, school, the internet, role models, early sexuality, cyberbullying, revenge pornography, social media, and their role in the modern conditions of communication and socialization of children, and the growing distance between today's teenagers and their parents, none of these factors is approached from the perspective of searching for the causes. The school is justifiably presented as discredited, both intrinsically and externally. Competitive relationships between teachers and students between students abound, with no evidence of solidarity. The teachers seem embarrassed, scared, or even indifferent, and the students are lost and full of anger, constantly ready for a fight. However, these very characteristics reflect its deeper character. It is about today's public school, which teaches scattered information and skills to prepare the next cheap labor force to perpetuate exploitative relations, a school that gives birth to individualism and competition. The series completely lacks the slightest hint of whether there could be another school that could positively fulfill its role as a basic vehicle for transmitting knowledge, highlighting the potential of all children, cultivating and educating the new generations in the ideals of collectivity, solidarity, and sensitivity towards the most vulnerable. Correspondingly, the question must be asked, why is the internet overflowing with distorted, dangerous patterns? Is it the fault of the internet itself as a tool, an achievement of human labor? Or is it the fault of the financial and other interests that monopolize it, such as, for example, social media companies that see us all, including minors, as customers? Here too, both their goals and their contradictions are indicative of the entire controversy that has permanently opened up on the occasion of juvenile delinquency and domestic violence. For example, proposals for even greater monitoring and censorship of the internet. A controversy that is also part of the context of more general antagonisms between, for example, the Republicans and Democrats, and between bourgeois states and imperialist alliances. Let's ask ourselves a little deeper what we mean by a general social context. And what is it that possibly changes quality compared to before, and we see its negative effects? Is it school, friends, music, video games, the internet, or social networks? Is it all of these and even more? Is it as easy as independent and self-contained threads, which, if you manage to control them or put them on the right track, or even limit or cut some of them off, then you will ensure a good, healthy environment for your child? Is it all of the above, which all resemble a complex web in which each thread intertwines and complements one another, and all of them together spread out and cover a core that is none other than the rot of today's capitalist society in its deep decay and decline? The earth, which is approaching war, has to harden. The enormous expanding contrast between the wealth produced in society as a whole and the crumbs that each of us reaps, like poverty, war, fascism, refugees, and so many other things, are what makes the mass social consciousness harden. The dead ends and the outrage that flares up will become more wild and uncontrollable the more the real cause is not targeted. This violence and cruelty that embraces everything around us are also reflected in young people, most of the time in a specially concocted way. Taking the above and everything into account, then how do we protect our children? How do we form a counteroffensive? The basic prerequisite is that we ourselves realize that a fundamental, radical change in society is needed, and that we all consciously, collectively, struggle for this purpose. An awareness from which a corresponding attitude to life flows, which we try to inspire and attract in our own children.
You've been listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML, your home for local, national, and international news, all from a working class perspective. New Worker News is the official organ of the Communist Workers Platform. If you're a worker, we would like to hear from you. You can reach us at cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that's cwpusa@protonmail.com. If you would like more news from a worker's point of view, visit us at newworker.us. You can find weekly articles on events happening all over the country and internationally. If you've enjoyed the program and wish to see more working class reporting, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/New Worker. And thank you for listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML.